Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for allowing me to be here today and also to represent the Headspace program and particularly the Headspace School Support Program, which basically covers this idea of containing the ripple effects of suicide, particularly in school communities. Talking about suicide to a group such as this is not an easy thing to do, is it? Sitting here today, listening to me talking about suicide isn't necessarily straightforward for all of us. Can I say that suicide is a difficult topic to talk about, not just here, but also in our communities out there. So thank you. Yet what we know is that suicide is something that's likely to impact on all of us. Every single one of us in this room this morning will have in the future or already has been impacted in some way, some form, be it personally and or professionally by suicide. That's why I'm here today. It's important that our society increases our knowledge, increases our understanding of this issue that is so complex. So I'm going to just talk specifically mainly around the impact in a school setting so that we can help contain it in the schools and in our communities and help ultimately prevent suicide as well. I'll touch briefly on the size and the extent of the problem, what that means for suicide clusters and contagion. I'll look at specifically how we respond after a suicide event, specifically again in a school setting, and then if we get time, I'll talk about what it looks like in the online world. As you know, Headspace, and we've got a stall out there in the area that you came through, is funded federally by the Department of Health under the Department of Health Youth Mental Health Initiative. And we service people, young people and their families amongst 4 core streams: physical health, mental health, alcohol and other drugs, services, vocational, educational and employment. We're growing at a rapid rate. I think we're this year going to be opening 90 Headspace centres, so that's the front door of our services. And we also have an online service called Headspace, which is an online telephone counselling and support. And then the program that I work for, which is the School Support Program. And there are a couple of school support representatives in the audience here as well today who no doubt will make themselves known to people out there in the, whatever that's called out there. What do we call that? That'll do for you. Okay, the extent of the problem is suicide. I'm just going to touch really briefly on the statistics, because the statistics tell us some things about the problem of the suicide, and it gives us a point to work from. But statistics, as you know, only tell us a certain amount. What we do know, however, that suicide is the leading cause of death for young people in Australia aged 15 to 24. Suicide accounts for 1 in 4 deaths among young people. If you look at that slide, you can see that suicide accounts for more deaths than car accidents, drugs, motorcycle accidents, pedestrian accidents and cancer. Suicide is the leading cause of death for young people that you work with in Australia. So let's unpack some of that a little bit. So when I talk about the continuum of suicide, the related behaviour in adolescents, this is what we're talking about, their adolescent lifetime. We look at suicidal thoughts or feelings. It's actually not an uncommon thought for a young person, or an adult actually, to have thoughts of suicide. We don't have time today to go into what those thoughts of suicide might feel like, sound like, act like, but it's not actually an uncommon thought. It's not something that just happens to a certain group of people out there. It would have happened to people here in this room as well. What is more uncommon is for people to go and act on those thoughts. And certainly what is more uncommon again is for people to die by suicide. So despite suicide being the leading cause of death for young people, Suicide in itself is actually quite a rare event. However, its impact can be incredibly traumatic for a community and for individuals as well. The statistics tell us that we have reached a 10-year peak for the number of people that have died by suicide. So the Australian Bureau of Stats release their information every 2 years, and the most recent information we have is that 2,535 people in our country died by suicide, that we know of. So they're the types of deaths that the coroner has 100% determined that the death was by suicide. So you can imagine that there are also deaths that could well be suicide that wouldn't fall into that category. 2,535 people, which is a rate of 11.2 people per 100,000. This is equivalent to around 7 people per day, or 37 men and 12 women each week. Suicide is the 14th most common cause of death in the country. And again, it's the leading cause of death for young people aged 15 to 24, plus the age group above that, 25 to 44 as well. I know I might be painting a bit of a bleak picture. Let me tell you, there is hope. We're going to talk further around that as we go. So we can respond appropriately, we need to understand it better. And these are just a few of the myths that are out there around suicide in our community. You know, and often the root cause of misunderstanding is based in stigma, even though the stigma is improving in our communities. You know, we fear things we don't understand, don't we? And I understand that. For example, sometimes out in our community we hear things like, I shouldn't ask somebody if they're thinking of suicide because that might maybe encourage them to go on and do it. Or maybe I might put the idea in your head. Me talking about suicide this morning, you're not all going to go home tonight and go, there's an idea I hadn't thought of. I just don't have that power. Just by raising it and talking about it does not put the idea in your head. However, if it is in people's heads already, it's something they might have been thinking about, in fact, it often has the opposite effect. By somebody coming alongside me with no judgment or fear or feeling like they have to fix it or provide advice and provide all the answers, but just says, hey, are you travelling okay? By some of the stuff I hear you've been saying, I'm a little bit concerned. When you said that before, were you talking about killing yourself? Was that about suicide? Actually can have such a life-saving impact and can have the opposite effect. So that's just one myth that is out there. So people consider taking their own life, as I said, is a really complex behaviour caused by a range of factors, and it is rarely caused by one single event, despite what some media outlets would like to tell us. Sometimes when we say that this person's suicided because of one single event, by minimising the complexities, not only does disservice to the complexities, but it also minimises the type of help that these young people should receive. Many people who die by suicide, up to 90% of people, have experienced mental health difficulties such as depression at their time of their death. General distress and mental illness both have a negative impact on our cognitive abilities, making rational thinking and decision-making difficult, just like what the professor was telling us in the previous session. You know, often people who are thinking about suicide feel like they're a burden on their family and friends. Everything would be better off without me. If only they knew that that's not the case. People who suicide often experience a high level of hopelessness and or helplessness, whether true, perceived or learned, that is what it is, and feel like that there's no way of escaping their pain. We often call it suicide the tunnel, when they feel like that there is no other option at the end of that tunnel except to die by suicide. Because we often also call suicide the choiceless choice, the choice that people make when they feel like they don't have other options. They've probably tried those other options and feel like they haven't worked for them. However, it's really important that we take into account, particularly with young people, impulsivity because of their brain development. As such, their ability to control their impulses and think through the consequences of their actions may not be fully developed. And you add in perhaps problematic alcohol or other drug use, and then that can also increase impulsivity. But the good news is, someone who is considering suicide is just doing that, just considering it. They're thinking about it. People who have thoughts of suicide and have made actual thoughts and might have implemented plans to put those thoughts into place still want to live. They're still ambivalent. The part of them that's sitting in your office telling you how much life sucks and they just want to escape, the part of them that is communicating that to you, the part of them that is sitting there telling you that things are that bad, is also the part of them that's somewhere deep inside that wants to live, that wishes it was different. I'm not saying that they perhaps know that, but this is that ambivalence. And that's what we work with in suicide prevention and postvention services, is the ambivalent. And what we know is that they work because we can help to increase their hopefulness. So keeping that in mind, I want to talk to you a little bit around the school support program. This is a national service that is based in every state and territory in Australia. And we provide support to secondary schools, independent, government and Catholic, that are affected by suicide. We've only been in full service operation for just over 12 months. As we know that the school systems out there are incredibly different, state by state and territory, and incredibly complex as well. So therefore our service has to be flexible to meet the needs of the school systems. We provide multidisciplinary teams to deliver a consistent and coordinated approach to suicide postvention services for young people, parents, staff in schools. We work with them as well to help prepare them and feel able to respond appropriately in the event of a suicide occurring. Our evidence-based postvention responses aim to provide bereavement support and advocacy for those affected by the suicide, and also prevent further suicide events, including contagion, suicides and suicide clusters. We work amongst these circles of vulnerability, we call them. You don't have to know the person who died for it to have an impact on you. So sometimes in schools we might, only maybe look out for those 5 friends of that young person that might have died or attempted suicide. Yet there might be a kid or a staff member or a family member who doesn't on the surface know that person for it to be having an impact on them. We're working with one particular school at the moment, not in New South Wales, where they're experiencing their 5th suicide death in the last 6 months, over the 6-month period. That impact on that school community is huge, and any of you here who have experienced a similar experience in your school community will know what I'm talking about. And amongst those 5 deaths were a couple of students, a parent and a teacher, and also a non-teaching staff member as well. Why is suicide different to other critical incidents? The impact is not the same as other traumatic life events in a school. I was talking to an ex-school principal just the other week. I think he was a school principal for 30-odd years, and now he's working in a different field. And he said to me, in about his 2nd year as a school principal, one of the young people in his care died by suicide. And as he was talking to me about it, it was like it happened last week. The way he was talking about it, he was absolutely fine and he was okay, but you could see that it was present with him as well. The impact is huge. Trauma and grief responses are often prolonged and far-reaching. And the suicide of one student can increase the risk of other students, as I said, who might view suicide as a viable option to deal with their problems. So the resilient students in the middle, we're working in postvention, but it's also kind of like a cycle as well, because solid postvention work means that we're also preventing suicide, and we're there to help intervene early and provide that intervention when required. I'm going to show you a quick movie clip of a school principal talking about the impact of suicide and why it's a good idea to prepare and how we can also respond. It goes for about 2 minutes.
Hello, I'm Cherie Vertigan, President of the Australian Secondary School Principals Association and a committed and passionate board member of the National Youth Mental Health Foundation Headspace. As an experienced secondary school principal, leading a school and a school community can be incredibly complex and challenging. Australian school principals are often faced with issues that impact on learning, such as bullying, challenging behaviour, self-harm, the impact of social media on young people, and the increase in the number of young people with mental health issues, including anxiety and depression. Of all the challenges, the most complex and devastating thing that a principal may face is the suicide of a student. The suicide of a young person has just enormous consequences, both in the short term and the long term. It can have wide-reaching impacts on students, teachers and families, not only across your school, but across multiple school communities.
Following a suicide, students, staff and parents may feel shock, disbelief, confused, a sense of hopelessness and even anger. International evidence shows that a suicide in your school community may heighten the vulnerability of other students. Simply put, exposure or knowledge of the suicide of a young person in their community may increase the risk of vulnerable students acting on their own suicidal ideas or thoughts. Whilst suicide contagion and clusters are rare, they are most prevalent in adolescents. The latest evidence shows that one of the key factors in suicide prevention is ensuring your school has a plan of how you would respond if there was a suicide of a student. In responding to a suicide, principals and school leaders will need to inform, support, and manage the situation. Pre-planning for this can enhance the quality of your school's response.
Principals play a pivotal role in preparation and response to youth suicide. Schools can also play an important role in preventing future suicide. Preparation is critical. As a school principal, we want to be able to return to the normal business of education as quickly and as responsibly as possible. This is not something that schools need to do alone. Planning for and managing a response to a death by suicide requires a coordinated, informed and evidence-based approach. This can also reduce the risk of further suicide in your school community.
I guess if all you get out of today is just a little bit more information that you might have already had, but it just increases your understanding or awareness around the issue of suicide in schools, then that's fantastic as far as we're concerned. Or it might be that you get a little bit more out of this and think, I wonder if our school is connected to this and would like to know more about what it is that we can do to help prepare in the unlikely event of a suicide. Or it might be that you're experiencing a suicide event in your school at the moment and would like some proactive help in how to manage that. I'm going to talk to you a little bit around what it is, some of our service components. Again, this might just be information for you, or it might be that you want to access it a little bit further. Our main area of work is working with teaching staff and school leadership and wellbeing staff. So we're there to provide the behind-the-scenes support in either preparing or responding or building capacity in the schools through education and training of teaching staff and other staff. So we're there to support, we're actually there to support you do your work with your young people. We don't come in and do the work for you, we're just there to provide the support behind the scenes, which we think is a critical component of our program because you're the ones that are working with these young people every day. And also it's really important that your school gets back to business as usual. Business as usual in a well-recovered school with the hope that we'll prevent suicide occurring again. So I'm just going to talk briefly around preparing. Schools need to be prepared to respond to a suicide. What we know is that school leadership teams need to make predictable, calm decisions when faced with such an unpredictable space. As Cherie said in the clip just then, could have devastating impact on school. We need our leadership teams to be ready to make a calm and predictable decision. So that requires a planned and coordinated team-based response, including those crucial streamlined referrals to the appropriate services and agencies, including the mental health services. It also minimises risk and focuses on maintaining protective factors. A coordinated evidence-based response will shorten the period of recovery and restore the wellbeing of staff, students and families as soon as possible. We work with school teams around this toolkit, which is a guide to responding to the needs of the school community impacted by suicide. We also have a principals checklist of all the things that we would need to do in the event of a suicide. As you can imagine, none of this is possible unless we're collaborating with the appropriate departments and authorities. We never go into a school unless we're invited. Of course, that goes without saying. So to do that, we have to have good relationships on a really high strategic level with the education departments and the appropriate Catholic Education Office and independent school boards, plus also with school principals and leadership teams and wellbeing teams, and then the community services and the appropriate health departments as well. So in the event of a suicide or a suicide event, be it attempted suicide, we provide advice, support and assistance to the school leadership team to provide the appropriate evidence-led response. So we could help inform teachers, staff, parents, key adults. We support staff with their own grief and response. We also provide support to young people, we support the staff to provide support to young people, and we also assist in managing media, social media and the narrative that can arise out of that. And then we can provide an ongoing support up to 12, 18 months, however long is needed after that. So we can physically send in our qualified clinicians into a school to provide support to the key personnel in that school if it's required and if it's asked of us. And we can be anywhere there and anywhere in New South Wales up to a day. That day sometimes, the team in the room can certainly tell stories around that. We could be in that school and by the afternoon, we could be in the school whenever is required or needed, and we will absolutely take the lead of the school. So in terms of, these stats are well out of date, they're about 6 months old, but the more that the school communities and the leadership and the departments know about us, the busier we are. So we're responding on average this term up to about 3 deaths across the country a week. Having said that, there's been about 6 or 7 this week that we've been responding to across the country as well. So that can be young person, parent, teacher, anybody that is attached to that school community. We work in Indigenous communities, we work in remote, regional, urban, metro, same thing as urban communities. I just want to leave you with something that I think is probably relevant in terms of what we're talking about today around the online space and specifically around what happens online after a suicide. I think we have to keep in mind that the speed and exchange of information can often add to the risk. However, it can also be a protective factor. In grief, sadness and shock, young people want to connect, be it that in person or be it online. However, we have to be really mindful that we don't glamorise the suicide, which can increase the risk. That's why there are really strong guidelines about reporting suicide in media, which goes around not reporting the method and or the location, whilst acknowledging the death and providing help-seeking messages. We want to mimic that online as well. If people are talking about the suicide, teachers and schools and parents need to acknowledge it and be open to discussing it, of course, with the family's guidelines around what they would like to be discussed. And also we need to keep in mind that we need to provide the safe and monitored spaces for young people to be able to talk about it. with appropriate help-seeking messages. So that's physically as well as online. This is also where we encourage our young people to look out for each other as well. Any messages of, I want to go where they went, I'm thinking of killing myself too, need to be treated seriously. Any threat of suicide needs to be taken seriously until we know different. And that's a really important message after the suicide event as well. In closing, this brief scenario based on a true situation that happened, again, not in New South Wales. In March 2013, a Year 9 girl died by suicide in a metropolitan area. She had written a comment on Facebook saying she was going to end her life, and she did. Within 2 hours of her death, this message that had been written on Facebook had been liked by 300 young people. Within 4 hours of her death, her social group had confirmed her suicide and agreed to meet at the train line, the same train line that she took her own life at. Monday afternoon at 4 p.m, approximately 100 young people from over 6 schools, so it's not just the one school, 6 schools had gathered at that train line. The news of her death included accurate information, which is important that we acknowledge, and it also included rumoured information. So we would work with you around this type of scenario, and they're not all like this by any stretch of the imagination. But this is unfortunately not an uncommon scenario that could occur after a suicide death. And we would talk to you, look at that and you can see some of the risks, can't you? I can see some physical risks as well, which is often equally concerning. So we would work with the school and the parent community and the young people or around some of the messages of safety, the risks and the responsibilities that we have in this situation. So in the future, we know that there's no other program like this in the world. So we're doing the work based on the best information and evidence that we have, which is informing the practice. So we're consolidating as we go. We know that suicide is preventable, otherwise we couldn't do our jobs. We have hope and we believe that providing the support to the school communities only goes to increase the safe and supportive environments that you are all working so hard to keep. Thank you.